All right, so now that we've got all of our content together, we can go ahead and style all of the text that we've got on our website. So in this lesson, I'm going to cover a number of font properties so that we can further style and make our website look the way that we want it to. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the font size. And to begin with, I want my H1 to be a lot bigger than my H2s and my H3s so that it really stands out as the title of this front page. So let's head over to Atom and implement that change. So inside my H1, I'm going to tap into the font size property, and I'm going to set the font size to 90 pixels. So this is equivalent of selecting 90 in the drop-down menu when you're selecting a font size. And now if I hit refresh, then my title is going to get a lot bigger and it's going to fill most of that top page. Now at this point, make sure that you're not zoomed in or zoomed out and that your browser is at 100% zoom. And you can check this by just going to zoom in or zoom out, and you can see whether if you're on 100% or 110%. So we want it to be 100% so we can see what everybody else should see by default. Now, currently, our font size is set to be 90 pixels. So on certain browsers, if the user goes into preferences and they change their default font size for their web page, for example, if they need super large text in order to see, then you'll notice that font size does not change, even though the rest of the text does. And this is because this is not a dynamic size. So in order to make it dynamic, there's two options. So let's head back over here and just go back to the medium size. And if we go into Atom, then instead of using pixels, instead we can use something like a percentage. So 100% in terms of font size is actually a 16 pixel size. And so that means if we want 90 pixels, so that means 90 divided by 16, and that would be equal to 562.5, then we would need 562.5% in order to get the equivalent of 90 pixels. So if we hit save and we go back to our website and I hit refresh, you'll notice that absolutely nothing happens because we're specifying exactly the same font size, but instead we're using a percentage this time. So that means that if we go into, say, preferences and we change our font size to very small or very large, then that font size will scale with it. Now, the other way of specifying a dynamic font size is by using a unit called the EM. For example, if we head back onto our favorite website, techcrunch.com, and we highlight this title here and we inspect it, then if you select this H2 here, you'll see that it's got the class called live title and its font size is specified as 2EM rather than however many pixels they want it to be. Now we've seen EM before inside our HTML and we used it as a tag in order to emphasize a particular section of text, and that stylistically means that it'll make something italicized. Now in this case, this is actually a completely different EM. And the EM in this case is actually the phonetic pronunciation of the letter M. And the reason is because in typesetting in the olden days, the EM, or the M rather, is the width of the capital letter M. And so that means that when you say 1 EM, then you want the font size to be 1 times the width, the capital letter M. And if you want 2, then that's double the size of the M, etc., etc. Now, in modern days, this is no longer true. But what is true is that 1 EM or 1 M is 16 pixels, as we've seen with our percentages. So 16 pixels is equal to 100% when you're talking about fonts, and it's equal to 1 M or 1 EM. And that means that you can achieve whatever size you want dynamically using either of these methods. So for example, as we calculated before, 90 pixels is equal to 5.625 EM. And so that means that if we replace our font size with that number, and we hit save, and we go back to our site and we hit refresh, then you'll see again the font size does not change because they are all the same. It's just using different ways of specifying the same size. So then the question you might have is, why would you use one over the other? What does it matter? And if you look on different websites, for example, take uber.com, and if we inspect on their title here, then you'll notice that their font size is specified in pixels, whereas on TechCrunch it's specified in EMs. And on other sites you might get percentages. Now, as we mentioned before, if we change the font size, for example, say somebody with accessibility issues, to very large, then these static sized fonts do not change. It stays exactly the same size. Whereas the things that are dynamically sized, for example, things using EM or percentages, they do scale up so that users who have maybe visual impairments, etc., who might want to have a higher font setting, will be able to view the website more comfortably. And that's quite important in terms of making your website accessible to everybody. Now, the argument against that is some web designers say that people with visual impairment these days are more likely to zoom in rather than changing their default font size. And they're more likely to have a higher zoom in order to read all the text on page. And with zoom, it doesn't actually matter whether if your text is statically or dynamically sized, because it will just scale up the website depending on what you're asking it to do. So maybe that's not such an important distinction between statically and dynamically sized fonts anymore, but there is one thing that is really important. And that's the fact that when you're using EM or when you're using percentages, that value is inherited. So if I go into the body here and I specify a font size for everything inside the body, so that's everything on my website, to be, say, 2 EM, and then in my H1, I leave my font size as the previous dynamic size. I hit save, and let's head back to our website and we refresh. Then you'll notice that our H1 has now become absolutely gigantic. And that's because the font size gets inherited and added on top of whatever it got from its parent. So the parent of the H1 is the body here because it's contained inside the body. And in the body, we said that font size should be 2 EM across the entire body of the website. Now, when it gets to the H1, it's already got that 2 EM applied. And then it adds that 5.625 on top of the 2 EM, which is why we end up with something so gigantic. And this is exactly the same with percentages. So if I said, say, 200% in our font size, and I change this to 562.5%, then again, we still get this gigantic font size. But say if I said, the font size should be 20 pixels, and over here it should be 90 pixels, and we go over here, we head back and we refresh, then you see that that font size is staying as 90 pixels. It does not matter what its parent's font size was, because these are static sizes. So that means it can get a little bit dangerous. For example, if you wanted all the text inside your body to be 200%, which remember is 2 times 16 pixels, which is 32 pixels. Now, that works fine until you get to a point and you forgot that you did that. And over here, you ended up setting your 5.625 EM or your percent. And then all of a sudden, oh, what's going on? Why does it look like this? And you have to go and debug and try and figure out where did it get this font size from. So for example, we can inspect in our Chrome developer tools and you see, okay, so it's got font size 5.625. That's what I want. But do I have any font sizes anywhere else? And here in the body, even though it's crossed out, that 200% is still being applied. So in order to avoid this, one of the things that we got in the latest version of CSS, which is the version that we're using currently, or the version that I'm teaching you about, is CSS 3. And inside CSS 3, there is something called the REM. and that refers to the root EM. So that means ignore all of the parent settings for the font size and just set it to this relative to the root. So that means that it doesn't matter what we've done here or in its enclosing containers or parents, it will be 5.625 times 16 pixels as long as we add the R in front of the EM. So if we hit save and we head back over to our website, hit refresh, then you can see that we still get that size that we wanted, which is the 5.625 REM. So the beauty of the root EM is that it does not get affected by upstream size changes. And it means that it's easier to debug and it's less likely that something will go wrong. So when sizing text, my personal recommendation to you is to use REM instead of EM or percentages or pixels, because that is the most adaptable and also the most reliable and least error prone. So now if we head back over to our site and refresh and also change our font size in our preferences back to the medium that's recommended, then you can see that we've got the exact size that we were looking for, which is the same as the 90 pixels that we specified. But this is done using REM rather than EM or percentages. Now, here's a challenge for you. We want to change the size of this part which says A programmer. Now at the moment, A programmer is inside a paragraph tag. Now we've got several other paragraph tags on this page, so we don't want to change the size of all of them. So first, I want you to change this element from a paragraph element into an H2 element. And I want you, as a challenge, to set the font size of the H2 to be equivalent to 40 pixels. But I want you to do that using REM. So pause the video, go ahead and see if you can figure it out. So that's pretty easy to calculate. So our target is 40 pixels for the font size. And we know that 1 EM is 16 pixels. So we can simply divide 40 by 16 and we end up with 2.5. So it'll be 2.5 REM in order to achieve the equivalent of 40 pixels for the font size of our H2. So let's go over to Atom and implement that. So inside our H2, let's go ahead and set the font size to 2.5 REM, hit save and refresh, and voila. We've now got a much larger subtitle and heading by changing the font size. So if that was confusing at all, make sure that you rewind and rewatch some of the parts where we spoke about dynamic font sizing and how it all worked. But now there's just one thing that I want to change about the layout of this website. I would love for this H1 to have a little bit more padding from the top so that it gets pushed down more towards the center of the page. So we can do that by simply adding a 50 pixel margin to the top of our H1 rather than having it as 0 pixels. So let's go into Atom and change the margin top to 50 pixels. This is what we end up with. Now, with margin top and padding and all of those other things where we specify a size, you can also use the EM, the REM, or the percentage values. But in this case, I actually prefer to stick to using pixels because it's more precise and it's much easier to see what's going on when you inspect it in using the box model. So that's just a personal preference and it's a stylistic choice of your own. So if you want to use REM or EM or percentages, that's absolutely fine as well. And it works exactly the same way as we mentioned with the font sizing. So basically, as long as you insert a 50 pixel equivalent margin, then we should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Now, there's one more thing that I would like to change here after we've specified our font sizes, and that's to have a little bit less space between the H1 and the H2 here, because at the moment, if I hit inspect, you can see that the H1 has a significant amount of margin before and after, and I would just like to get rid of that bottom margin. So instead of specifying the margin top, we can just specify a margin using the circle shorthand. So we start off with the top, which is going to have 50 pixel margin. Then we go to the right, which I'm going to keep as auto to keep it centered. Then we get to the bottom, which I want to be 0. And finally, we have the left, which I'm going to leave as auto as well. Now if we hit save and we head back and close down our Chrome developer tools, and now we hit refresh, you can see that we've got a little bit less space between the H1 and the H2, and it just looks a little bit more put together. Now, these are all minor tweaks, and it's totally up to you if you want to implement them or not. I'm just adjusting it to my eye. Now, in the next lesson, I've got a number of challenges for you, and I want you to use the developer docs on MDN or on W3 Schools in order to figure out what these properties are and how you should set them. But you should be fully equipped in order to discover some of these other font-related properties that I want to talk about. So head over to the next lesson and complete the challenge.